After 45 years of separation, a Vietnam veteran was about to reunite with the elephant who had saved his life during the war, a meeting that seemed impossible in every way. What happened next would leave everyone at the sanctuary in tears, proving that some bonds transcend time itself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Are you absolutely certain it's him? Thomas Mitchell questioned, his weathered hands trembling as he held a faded Polaroid photograph showing a young soldier standing beside a magnificent Asian elephant. The image, yellowed with age, captured a moment frozen in time, a 23-year-old army medic and the elephant who had become his unexpected companion during the darkest days of the Vietnam War. Now at 68, Thomas found himself returning to Thailand, a journey he never thought he'd make again. Life had taken him far from those tumultuous days in Southeast Asia. After the war, he had returned home to Montana, building a quiet life as a small-town doctor, trying to heal others while nursing his own invisible wounds. But he had never forgotten about Kong, the elephant who had not only carried medical supplies through treacherous jungle terrain, but had also saved his life during an ambush that still haunted his dreams. The news had reached him through an unlikely source, a documentary filmmaker who had been researching war elephants in Southeast Asia. They had discovered an elderly elephant at the Sacred Plains Sanctuary, whose markings and age matched Kong's description. More surprisingly, the elephant still carried a distinctive scar on his left ear, a marking Thomas had documented in his war journal. 45 years is a lifetime, Thomas murmured, running his fingers over the photograph one more time before carefully tucking it into his shirt pocket close to his heart. The flight to Bangkok had been long, giving him too much time to wonder if this journey would bring closure or simply reopen old wounds. As his taxi wound through the busy streets of Chiang Mai, Thomas's mind drifted back to 1968. He could still feel the oppressive heat, hear the distant sounds of artillery, and remember the gentle touch of Kong's trunk against his shoulder after particularly difficult days. The elephant had seemed to sense when the young medic needed comfort, displaying an emotional intelligence that had surprised everyone in the unit. When he arrived at Sacred Plains Sanctuary, he was greeted by Dr. Sunan Patel, a renowned elephant behaviorist who had been studying the sanctuary's oldest residents. Her eyes sparkled with curiosity as she shook Thomas's hand. "Your story is quite extraordinary, Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice warm and professional. "When our team learned about Kong's military history, we could hardly believe it. The sanctuary had changed significantly since the war years. What had once been dense jungle was now a sprawling conservation center, home to dozens of rescued elephants. Dr. Patel explained that Kong had arrived there nearly 15 years ago, transferred from a logging camp where he had worked after the war. "He's always been different from our other elephants," Dr. Patel explained as they walked through the sanctuary's main path. "There's something in his behavior that suggests military training, the way he responds to certain commands, how he positions himself when startled. But more than that, he shows unusual interest in anyone wearing military clothing." Thomas listened intently, his heart racing with each detail that seemed to confirm this could indeed be his Kong. He shared with Dr. Patel how he had first met the elephant. Kong had been part of a small group of working elephants requisitioned by the army to help transport medical supplies through areas too dense for vehicles. The young medic had been assigned to work with Kong, and their bond had formed almost immediately. "He saved my life," Thomas said softly, pausing along the path. "We were ambushed one night. Kong not only sheltered me from gunfire with his own body, but managed to carry me and 3 wounded soldiers to safety. That scar on his ear, he got it that night." Dr. Patel's expression softened with understanding. "Mr. Mitchell," she said gently, I want you to be prepared. While elephants have remarkable memories, Kong has been through a lot since the war. He's one of our oldest residents now, and his temperament can be unpredictable. A young sanctuary worker named Mai joined them, carrying a folder of Kong's medical records. He does seem to recognize certain military sounds, she added hopefully. Last month, when a veterans group visited, he became very alert at the sound of their dog tags. Thomas nodded, trying to keep his expectations in check. Yet he couldn't help but feel a surge of hope as they approached the observation area. Somewhere in this sanctuary was an elephant who might remember a young medic from a lifetime ago, a bond forged in the crucible of war. Whether Kong would recognize him remained to be seen, but Thomas knew he had to try. He owed it to both of them to at least make the attempt. Thomas nodded, trying to keep his expectations in check. Yet he couldn't help but feel a surge of hope as they approached the observation area. Somewhere in this sanctuary was an elephant who might remember a young medic from a lifetime ago, a bond forged in the crucible of war. Whether Kong would recognize him remained to be seen. But Thomas knew he had to try. He owed it to both of them to at least make the attempt. As they walked, Thomas pulled out his old military journal from his backpack, its pages worn and dog-eared from decades of occasional reading. I documented everything about him, he explained, showing Dr. Patel and Mai the detailed sketches he had made of Kong's distinctive markings. The pages contained not just medical notes about the elephant's health during the war, but personal observations about Kong's personality, his fondness for ripe mangoes, his habit of gently swaying when he sensed tension in the camp, and the unique way he would cross his front legs when resting. These notes could be invaluable, Dr. Patel said, carefully examining the journal's yellowed pages. They might help us understand some of Kong's current behaviors. We've noticed he has certain routines that seemed unusual for elephants raised in traditional settings. Mai pointed to one of Thomas's sketches. Look at this. The way you've drawn him resting. We've seen him do exactly this, especially during the afternoon rest periods. None of our other elephants display this particular behavior. Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. Each small confirmation added to his growing hope, yet simultaneously heightened his anxiety about the upcoming reunion. The sanctuary's observation area was just around the next bend, and somewhere beyond those trees waited an elephant who had once been more than just a military asset. He had been a friend, a protector, and a symbol of hope during one of the darkest chapters of Thomas's life. We should take a moment here, Dr. Patel suggested, noting Thomas's emotional state. Would you like to tell us more about that night? The ambush you mentioned? Sometimes sharing these memories can help prepare us for what's ahead. Thomas nodded, grateful for the brief respite before what could be one of the most significant moments of his life. The weight of 45 years pressed heavily on his shoulders as he prepared to share the full story of how an elephant's courage had changed the course of his life forever. Thomas took a deep breath, settling onto a wooden bench beneath a towering banyan tree. The humid Thai air felt thick with memories as he began to share the story he had carried for 45 years. Dr. Patel and Mai listened intently, their eyes focused on the veteran's weathered face as he transported them back to that fateful night in 1968. It was during the monsoon season. Thomas began, his voice steady despite the weight of the memories. We were transporting medical supplies through the jungle to a forward medical station. Kong was carrying the bulk of our supplies, antibiotics, plasma, surgical equipment, things we couldn't risk losing to the mud and rain. The jungle was different at night back then, filled with shadows that could hide any number of threats. He paused, running his fingers along the worn edges of his journal. We had a small security detail, just 4 men besides myself, standard. Procedure for a medical transport. Kong had been unusually restless that evening, constantly testing the air with his trunk. I should have paid more attention to his behavior. Elephants sense things we can't. Dr. Patel nodded knowingly. Their infrasonic communication and acute sense of smell make them incredibly perceptive to changes in their environment. The ambush came without warning, Thomas continued, his eyes distant. The first explosion hit about 20 yards ahead of us, sending shrapnel through the canopy. In the chaos that followed, I lost track of everything except Kong's presence. Instead of bolting, which would have been the natural reaction, he moved deliberately toward a dense cluster of trees. Thomas's hands trembled slightly as he pulled out another photograph from his journal, this one showing a much younger version of himself bandaging Kong's ear. 3 of our men were hit in the initial attack. I was trying to drag them to cover when Kong did something remarkable. He positioned himself between us and the incoming fire, using his body as a shield. Then, one by one, he helped me lift the wounded men with his trunk, carrying them to safety behind those trees. Mai gasped softly, her hand covering her mouth. He understood they needed help. "More than that," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. He seemed to understand exactly what needed to be done. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. While I worked on the wounded, he maintained his position, protecting us. That's when he took the bullet to his ear, never moved an inch despite the injury. We lost good men in Vietnam, but not a single soldier died that night, thanks to Kong. Dr. Patel made some notes in her folder, her professional demeanor softening. This explains so much about his behavioral patterns. We've noticed he becomes extremely protective of injured elephants in our sanctuary, often standing guard until they recover. After that night, our bond changed, Thomas continued. It went beyond the usual relationship between a handler and a working elephant. Kong would wait outside the medical tent when I was treating patients, almost like he was standing guard. He'd inspect every new soldier who came under my care, as if checking them for injuries. The veteran's voice cracked slightly as he reached the hardest part of the story. When the order came to transfer him to a different unit, I fought it hard, argued that he was essential to our medical operations. But the brass had made up their minds. They needed him for a logging operation supporting the construction of a new airfield. The day they took him away, he reached out with his trunk, touching my chest right above my heart. It was like he was saying goodbye. Thomas stood up, walking a few steps away from the bench to compose himself. That was the last time I saw him. When the war ended, I tried to track him down, but the records were a mess. Working elephants changed hands so many times in those days. Eventually, I had to accept that I'd never know what happened to him. Dr. Patel rose from the bench, placing a gentle hand on Thomas's shoulder. And now, after all these years, you might have found him again. Mr. Mitchell, I want you to know that while we can't guarantee Kong will remember you, every detail you've shared matches our observations of him. The protective behavior, the unusual military-like discipline, even the way he responds to injured animals. It all fits. Mai, who had been quietly taking notes, looked up with bright eyes. The morning team has reported that Kong is currently in the east sector of the sanctuary. If you're ready, we can begin making our way there. Thomas squared his shoulders, years of military bearing showing in his posture despite his age. I've waited 45 years for this moment. Whether he remembers me or not, I need to see him. I need to know that he's okay, that he's had a good life. As they prepared to move toward the east sector, Thomas felt a mix of emotions he hadn't experienced since his days in Vietnam. Hope, fear, anticipation, and a deep, aching need for closure. The photograph in his pocket seemed to grow heavier. With each step, carrying the weight of nearly half a century of memories and unanswered questions. As they made their way through the sanctuary's winding paths, Dr. Patel briefed Thomas on Kong's current routines and behaviors. The morning sun had risen higher, casting dappled shadows through the canopy of tropical trees. The air was thick with the sounds of the sanctuary, distant elephant calls, the chatter of monkeys, and the constant hum of insects that Thomas remembered so vividly from his time in Vietnam. Kong has established himself as something of a patriarch among our elephants, Dr. Patel explained, navigating around a muddy section of the trail. While he generally keeps to himself, he's shown remarkable leadership qualities, especially in situations involving younger or injured elephants. It's quite unusual for a former working elephant to display such social complexity. Mai, walking slightly ahead, added, "He has a particular spot near the eastern watering hole where he spends most mornings. The other elephants seem to respect this as his territory. We've noticed he follows an almost military-like schedule, arriving and departing at almost exactly the same times each day." Thomas absorbed every detail, trying to reconcile the image of the young elephant he'd known with this aging patriarch they described. "Does he—" He hesitated, almost afraid to ask. "Does he show any signs of trauma from his war years?" Dr. Patel's expression grew thoughtful. "There are indicators. He becomes agitated during thunderstorms, more so than our other elephants. And he has an unusual reaction to certain mechanical sounds, particularly helicopter rotors. When tourist helicopters pass overhead, he seeks dense tree cover, often shepherding younger elephants with him." "The survival instincts," Thomas nodded, remembering how Kong would react to incoming aircraft during the war. "We trained him to seek cover when he heard choppers approaching. It was essential for medical transport units to avoid being spotted from the air." As they walked, Thomas shared more details about the training methods they'd used during the war, explaining how they'd developed special commands and signals for Kong. Dr. Patel listened intently, occasionally making notes in her folder. The information seemed to fill in gaps in their understanding of Kong's unique behaviors. "There's something else you should know," Mai interjected carefully. "Last year, during a veterans memorial event near the sanctuary, we played some military bugle calls as part of the ceremony, and Kong's reaction was remarkable. He stood at attention, perfectly still, throughout the entire call to colors. None of our other elephants showed any reaction at all." Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. The bugle calls had been an essential part of the military elephant's training, a way to communicate commands across long distances in the dense jungle. "We used retreat and call to colors as signals for the elephants to return to base," he explained, his voice thick with emotion. Kong learned to associate those sounds with safety. As they approached the eastern sector, Dr. Patel held up her hand, signaling them to stop. "We're getting close to his usual morning location," she said softly. "Before we go further, I need to explain our approach strategy. Kong can be protective of his territory, especially with strangers. We'll need to—" She was interrupted by a low, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath their feet. Thomas felt every hair on his arms stand up. It was a sound he hadn't heard in 45 years, but one he would never forget. "That's him," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "He used to make that exact sound when he was alerting us to something unexpected in the area." Mai checked her radio as it crackled to life. "The observation team is reporting that Kong has already detected our presence," she reported. "He's showing unusual interest in our direction. They say his behavior is agitated, but not aggressive." Dr. Patel quickly assessed the situation. "This is unusual. He rarely shows this much interest in sanctuary visitors, even during guided tours." She turned to Thomas. "Mr. Mitchell, are you carrying anything that might trigger a memory? Any specific sense or objects from your time together?" Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished object, a brass whistle on a worn leather cord. This was part of our communication system during the war. Each elephant had a whistle tuned to a specific pitch that only their assigned handler used. I haven't blown it since the day they transferred him. Dr. Patel's eyes widened with professional interest. The use of unique auditory signals is fascinating. Their memory for specific sounds can span decades. Would you consider... But before she could finish her question, another rumble echoed through the trees, closer this time. Through a gap in the foliage, Thomas caught a glimpse of movement, a massive grey form shifting among the shadows of the jungle. His hand tightened around the whistle as 45 years of separation suddenly collapsed into a single, heart-stopping moment. Through the dense foliage, the massive shape of Kong became more distinct, his enormous frame casting shadows in the morning light. Thomas felt his breath catch in his throat as he observed the changes time had wrought on his old friend. Kong's skin was more weathered now, marked with the subtle patterns of age, and his tusks had grown impressive with the passing decades. Yet there was something hauntingly familiar in the way he carried himself, a dignity that Thomas remembered from their shared past. "He's much larger than I remember," Thomas whispered, his voice trembling slightly. The elephant before them stood nearly 11 feet tall at the shoulder, his tusks gleaming ivory in the filtered sunlight. Dr. Patel placed a steadying hand on Thomas's arm as Kong took another step closer, his ears spread wide in what appeared to be curiosity rather than aggression. "That's unusual," Mai murmured, keeping her voice low. "He rarely approaches visitors so directly. Usually he maintains his distance, especially with unfamiliar males." She consulted her tablet quickly, scrolling through behavioral notes. "In fact, we haven't recorded this type of approach behavior in over 3 years. The ancient whistle felt heavy in Thomas's hand as he watched Kong's deliberate movements. Each step the elephant took seemed purposeful, measured, reminiscent of the careful way he used to navigate through dangerous terrain during their medical transport missions. Thomas found himself automatically checking Kong's gait for any signs of injury or distress, an old habit from his days as a medical officer that had never quite faded. "The scar," Thomas said suddenly, his eyes fixed on Kong's left ear. "It's exactly as I remembered it." The distinctive mark, a jagged line near the outer edge of the ear, stood out clearly now that Kong had moved into better light. It was the physical proof Thomas had been both hoping for and dreading, undeniable evidence that this was indeed the same elephant who had saved his life so many years ago. Dr. Patel made a quick note in her folder. "The scar tissue formation matches the approximate age you mentioned. We've documented it as being consistent with a bullet wound, though we never had confirmation of its origin until now." She paused, studying Thomas's reaction carefully. "Would you'd like to try using the whistle? Given his current behavior, this might be the ideal moment." Thomas ran his thumb over the whistle's worn surface, feeling the familiar grooves and dents. "We had a specific signal pattern," he explained, his voice thick with memory. 2 short blasts, then 1 long. It was our all-clear signal. It meant it was safe to approach. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the whistle. "I never thought I'd use this again." Dr. Patel nodded encouragingly while Mai readied her camera to document the interaction. The sanctuary's research team had been eager to understand more about Kong's military past, and this moment could provide valuable insights into elephant memory and trauma recovery. Taking a deep breath, Thomas raised the whistle to his lips. The first blast came out shakier than he'd intended, decades of disuse making the sound slightly uncertain. Kong's ears immediately flicked forward, his entire body becoming still. The second short blast was steadier, and by the time Thomas completed the pattern with the long note, his hands had stopped shaking. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Kong stood motionless, his trunk slightly raised, testing the air. Then slowly he began to sway from side to side, a movement so familiar that Thomas had to grip Dr. Patel's arm for support. "He used to do that," he whispered. "When he recognized the all-clear signal, he would sway just like that." Mai's camera clicked rapidly as Kong took another step forward, then another. His movement pattern was deliberate, almost ceremonial, matching the careful approach protocol they had developed for medical transport missions. Thomas found himself automatically shifting into the proper receiving position, muscle memory from countless similar encounters 4 decades ago taking over. "Remarkable," Dr. Patel breathed, watching the interaction unfold. "He's displaying clear recognition patterns, the measured approach, the ear position, the trunk carriage, it's all consistent with trained response behaviors." She made rapid notes in her folder, documenting every detail of the historic reunion. Kong was now less than 20 feet away, close enough for Thomas to see the intelligence still burning in those ancient eyes. The elephant's trunk extended slowly, testing the air around Thomas, drawing in scents that might trigger memories of shared dangers and triumph, of jungle trails and midnight missions, of trust forged in the crucible of war. Thomas stood perfectly, still, his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. In his mind, he was both the elderly veteran he had become and the young medic he had once been, standing on the edge of a moment that would either bridge or forever seal the gap of 45 years. The tension in the air was palpable as Kong's trunk moved through the space between them, investigating every detail of Thomas's presence. Dr. Patel and Mai watched in rapt silence, barely daring to breathe as this historic moment unfolded before them. The morning sounds of the sanctuary seemed to fade away, leaving only the soft rustle of leaves and Kong's deep, steady breathing. "Talk to him," Dr. Patel suggested softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "If there are any phrases or commands you used to use, now would be the time." Her experienced eyes noticed subtle changes in Kong's body language, the gentle sway of his head, the relaxed position of his trunk, the steady rhythm of his breathing, all indicating a growing comfort with Thomas's presence. Thomas swallowed, hard, his throat tight with emotion. When he finally spoke, it was in a mixture of English and Vietnamese, the same combination of languages he had used during the war. "Kong." "Jung Yen," he said, using the Vietnamese command for stay. Steady. That had been part of their training. His voice cracked slightly on the words, decades of stored emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Kong's reaction was immediate and astonishing. His ears flicked forward and a low rumble emerged from deep in his chest. The sound was so familiar that Thomas felt tears welling up in his eyes. It was the same acknowledging rumble Kong had used countless times during their missions together, a sound that had often meant the difference between life and death in the dangerous jungle nights. "Incredible," Mai whispered, her camera clicking rapidly to document every moment. "His vocal response matches exactly what you described from your war experiences." She glanced at her tablet, where Kong's normal behavioral patterns were documented. "This is completely outside his usual response range." Thomas took a careful step forward, his hand extended palm up, the way he used to offer Kong treats after successful missions. The elephant's trunk moved closer, gently exploring Thomas's outstretched hand. The touch was feather-light, almost hesitant, as if Kong was piecing together fragments of memory through scent and texture. "I used to carry palm sugar in my pocket for him," Thomas explained, his voice thick with emotion. "He could smell it, no matter how well I thought I'd hidden it." A small smile crossed his face at the memory. "Even during the most serious missions, he'd check my pockets first thing." As if responding to the memory, Kong's trunk moved to investigate Thomas's shirt pocket, where he had stored the old photograph. The gesture was so familiar, so precisely like his old habit, that Thomas couldn't hold back a sob. "You remember," he whispered. "After all these years, you actually remember." Dr. Patel made rapid notes, her professional composure slightly cracked by the emotion of the moment. "This level of specific memory retention is extraordinary," she said. "The fact that he's replicating behaviors from 45 years ago in response to the same commands and situations." She shook her head in amazement. "This could revolutionize our understanding of elephant memory and emotional bonds." Kong's trunk continued its gentle exploration, moving from Thomas's pocket to his shoulder, then to his face, mapping the features of his old friend. Thomas stood perfectly still, tears flowing freely now, as Kong's trunk delicately traced the contours of his face, much as he used to do when checking Thomas for injuries after particularly dangerous missions. "He used to do this whenever we came under fire," Thomas explained, his voice breaking. "He wouldn't settle until he'd checked every one of us for wounds. Saved more lives that way than any of our medical training. He could smell internal bleeding before we saw any external signs." The elephant's investigation paused at Thomas's chest, right above his heart, where Kong's trunk pressed gently, the exact spot he had touched on the day they were separated. The significance of the gesture wasn't lost on anyone present. Mai wiped tears from her eyes, even as she continued to document the reunion. "The specificity of his memory is astounding," Dr. Patel observed, her voice soft with wonder. "These aren't just general recognition patterns. He's replicating exact behaviors from your shared past, demonstrating not just memory, but emotional association as well." Thomas reached up slowly, placing his hand over Kong's trunk where it rested. Against his heart, "I never forgot you, old friend," he whispered. "Not a single day went by that I didn't wonder where you were, if you were safe." His voice broke completely then, decades of carried guilt and worry finally finding release. Kong responded with another deep rumble, this one longer and more complex in its vocalization. To everyone's amazement, he began to repeatedly touch Thomas's chest and then his own head, creating a connection between them that transcended the years of separation. It was a gesture that spoke of recognition, of remembered trust, of a bond that had somehow survived 45 years of silence. Dr. Patel signaled to Mai to radio the rest of the sanctuary staff, letting them know the extraordinary interaction they were witnessing. The reunion was exceeding all their expectations, providing unprecedented insights into elephant memory and emotional capabilities. As they watched, Kong began a series of gentle, almost ritualistic movements that Thomas immediately recognized. "He's doing his pre-mission check," Thomas explained, his voice filled with wonder. Before every medical transport, he would go through this exact routine, checking his surroundings in a specific pattern, establishing safe zones. His hands trembled as he watched Kong methodically survey the area, trunk moving in precise sweeps just as it had done countless times in the jungles of Vietnam. The elephant's behavior was so methodical, so clearly purposeful, that even the most skeptical observer would have struggled to dismiss it as coincidence. Kong moved with the same deliberate grace that had once guided medical supplies through dangerous territory, his movements a perfect mirror of training received nearly half a century ago. "This is remarkable," Dr. Patel said, furiously taking notes. "The precision of his remembered behaviors suggests that these weren't just trained responses. They were deeply integrated experiences." She paused, watching as Kong completed his sweep and returned his attention to Thomas. "In all my years of studying elephant behavior, I've never seen anything quite like this." Mai, who had been quietly documenting everything with her camera, suddenly noticed something extraordinary. "Look at his stance," she whispered excitedly. "He's positioned himself exactly as shown in Mr. Mitchell's old photograph." Indeed, Kong had shifted his weight and turned his head at the same angle captured in the yellowed Polaroid Thomas had carried all these years. Thomas slowly reached into his pocket and withdrew the photograph, holding it up next to Kong's current pose. The similarity was uncanny. Despite the decades that had passed, the elephant had assumed the exact same protective stance he had often taken when guarding the medical unit. It was as if time had momentarily folded in on itself, bringing past and present into perfect alignment. "We used to call this his sentry position," Thomas explained, his voice thick with emotion. "He would stand just like this while we treated the wounded, creating a safe space in the middle of chaos." He turned to Dr. Patel, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Do you think he's been carrying these memories all this time, just like I have?" Before Dr. Patel could respond, Kong made a decision that took everyone by surprise. With deliberate movements, he lowered himself to his knees, recreating a gesture that had once been part of their medical evacuation protocol. This position had allowed injured soldiers to be more easily lifted onto his back during rescue operations. "Oh my God," Thomas breathed, his hand covering his mouth. "We only use this signal in emergencies. It was our critical evacuation protocol." He turned to Dr. Patel, his voice urgent. "Has he ever done this before, with anyone else?" Dr. Patel shook her head, her professional composure momentarily forgotten in the face of such extraordinary behavior. "Never. We've observed him kneeling to rest or to forage, but this—" She gestured at Kong's formal, almost ceremonial posture. "This is completely unique. The deliberate nature of the movement, the specific positioning, it's clearly a learned behavior being intentionally reproduced." Mai's camera worked overtime, capturing every detail of this unprecedented display. "Should we be concerned?" she asked, noting how Kong maintained the position, waiting expectantly, as if ready to receive wounded soldiers. Thomas stepped forward, moving with the muscle memory of countless similar moments from the past. He placed his hand on Kong's shoulder, exactly where he used to touch him during their evacuation procedures. "It's okay, old friend," he said softly, slipping naturally into the mixture of English and Vietnamese they had used during the war. "All clear, Kong Ko Thuong Vong, no casualties." At these words, Kong slowly rose back to his feet, but remained close to Thomas, his trunk maintaining gentle contact with his old friend's shoulder. The behavior was so tender, so carefully executed, that Mai had to wipe tears from her eyes, even as she continued photographing. "He's not just remembering you," Dr. Patel said quietly, observing the ongoing interaction. "He's remembering your shared purpose, the mission that bound you together. This goes beyond simple recognition. He's demonstrating complex associative memory, linking specific commands and situations with appropriate responses." Thomas nodded, unable to speak as Kong continued his gentle examination, trunk moving with careful precision over his shoulders and back, checking for injuries that existed only in memory. It was a medical assessment from another time, performed with the same dedication that had once saved so many lives in the jungle darkness. The morning sun had risen higher now, casting dappled shadows through the canopy as this extraordinary reunion continued to unfold. In the distance, other elephants could be heard trumpeting, but Kong remained focused entirely on Thomas, as if making up for 45 years of lost time in these precious moments. The profound connection unfolding before them was suddenly interrupted by an unexpected commotion from the sanctuary's main path. A small group of tourists, unaware of the delicate reunion taking place, had wandered off their designated trail and were now approaching the restricted area. Their excited chatter and camera clicks created an immediate shift in the atmosphere. Kong's posture changed instantly, his military training surfacing as he assessed the potential threat. Before anyone could react, the elephant smoothly positioned himself between Thomas and the approaching group, just as he had done countless times during combat situations. The movement was so fluid, so purposeful, that Dr. Patel gasped audibly. "This is extraordinary," she whispered, frantically documenting the behavior. "He's demonstrating protective positioning that exactly matches your descriptions from the war. The angle of his stance, the way he's created a defensive barrier. It's textbook military protection protocol." Thomas felt a lump form in his throat as he watched Kong's protective display. "He used to do this whenever we heard unexpected movement in the jungle," he explained, his voice thick with emotion. "He would position himself to shield our medical team, especially when we were treating the wounded. Mai quickly radioed for security to redirect the tourist group, but the interruption had triggered something deeper in Kong's memory. The elephant began executing a series of precise movements that Thomas recognized immediately. It was their old evacuation routine, designed to secure an area and prepare for potential threats. "Look at how methodically he's scanning the perimeter," Thomas narrated, his medical officer's training evident in his detailed observations. "Three-point sweep, just like we taught him. Check the high ground first, then the approaches, then the evacuation routes." His voice cracked slightly. He hasn't forgotten any of it. Dr. Patel's professional composure wavered as she watched the display. "This goes beyond anything we've documented in elephant memory studies," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "The precision of these learned behaviors, the context-appropriate responses, he's not just remembering, he's actively implementing complex tactical training from decades ago." As the tourist group was led away, Kong maintained his protective stance until he was certain the perceived threat had passed. Then, in a gesture that brought tears to everyone's eyes, he turned back to Thomas and gently touched his chest with his trunk, their old signal for all clear. "During the war," Thomas explained, wiping his eyes, "this was how he let us know an area was secure. He would check each member of the team, making sure everyone was safe." He placed his hand over Kong's trunk, feeling the gentle pressure against his heart. "Some nights, when the fighting was particularly bad, he would keep checking us throughout the night, making sure we were all still breathing." Mai, who had been documenting everything, suddenly noticed something remarkable in her footage. "Doctor Patel, look at this," she said, showing her tablet screen. "The pattern of his movements. It's exactly the same as what Mr. Mitchell described in his journal. The three-point sweep, the protective positioning, even the all-clear signal. It's like watching his written accounts come to life." Dr. Patel studied the footage with intense interest. "This could revolutionize our understanding of elephant memory and emotional processing," she said. "The retention of such specific, complex behaviors over such a long period. It challenges everything we thought we knew about animal memory capabilities." As they watched, Kong began a new series of movements, each one triggering more memories for Thomas. The elephant was recreating their old supply inspection routine, checking imaginary medical packs with his trunk, just as he had done before each mission. The behavior was so precise, so deeply ingrained, that it seemed to transcend the decades that had passed. "We used to store the most critical supplies high on his back," Thomas explained, his voice distant with memory. "He learned to identify the weight and smell of different medical packages. If something was positioned wrongly, he would adjust it himself." He watched in amazement as Kong went through the motions of checking phantom supplies. He could even tell which packages contained plasma or morphine by their weight and scent, saved countless lives by keeping those supplies safe and properly arranged. The morning sun had risen higher now, casting long shadows through the trees. As this extraordinary reunion continued to reveal new layers of memory and connection, each movement, each gesture from Kong seemed to bridge the 45-year gap, bringing past and present together in an unprecedented display of elephant cognition and emotional memory. Dr. Patel made a quick call to the sanctuary's research. team, knowing that what they were witnessing would need to be thoroughly documented and studied. "Mr. Mitchell," she said softly, "would you be willing to share more details about your training methods? Understanding how these behaviors were taught could help us better comprehend how they've been retained for so long." Thomas nodded. "Never," taking his eyes off Kong as he began to explain. "The training was different from traditional elephant handling," he said, watching as Kong continued his methodical inspection routine. "We had to develop methods that would work in combat situations, ways to communicate silently and keep both the elephants and medical personnel safe." As if responding to Thomas's words, Kong demonstrated another remembered protocol, shifting his stance to create a natural shelter, a positioning technique they had used during monsoon seasons to protect medical supplies and wounded soldiers. From the rain, the accuracy of his movements, even after 45 years, was astounding. "We used a combination of touch signals and whistle commands," Thomas continued, his hand unconsciously moving to the brass whistle that still hung around his neck. Each elephant in the medical unit had their own specific whistle tone, so they wouldn't confuse commands meant for other elephants. He smiled faintly at the memory. Kong was always the quickest to learn new signals. Sometimes he seemed to understand what we needed before we even gave the command. Dr. Patel's eyes lit up with professional interest. "The use of individualized acoustic signals is fascinating," she said, making rapid notes. "It might explain why he's maintained such specific memory patterns. Did you incorporate any visual signals as well?" Before Thomas could respond, Kong made a sound that caused him to freeze in place, a low, pulsing rumble that he hadn't heard in over 4 decades. That's our danger signal," he whispered, his body automatically tensing in response. He used to make that exact sound when he sensed potential threats in the area. Mai quickly scanned the surroundings with her camera, trying to identify what had triggered Kong's warning. "There," she pointed toward a distant section of the sanctuary where a maintenance vehicle had started up, its engine producing a deep, rhythmic rumbling. "The sound pattern must be similar to something from your wartime experiences." Thomas nodded, his expression a mixture of amazement and emotion. "Artillery," he said softly. "That was how he warned us about distant artillery. Fire, the vibrations through the ground, he could feel them long before we could hear anything." He turned to Dr. Patel, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Do you understand what this means? He's not just remembering commands or behaviors, he's actively applying his training to new situations." Dr. Patel nodded, her scientific objectivity temporarily overcome by the weight of what they were witnessing. "This level of cognitive processing is extraordinary," she agreed. "He's demonstrating not just memory retention, but adaptive application of learned behaviors. It's as if the neural pathways formed during your time together have remained intact all these years." Kong maintained his alert posture until the maintenance vehicle moved out of range, then performed another thorough check of the area before returning to Thomas's side. The entire sequence was so professionally executed that it could have been a demonstration of military elephant protocols from decades ago. "You know what amazes me the most?" Thomas said, gently stroking Kong's trunk as the elephant resumed his protective positioning. "It's not just the memory of the commands or the behaviors, it's the understanding behind them. He always knew these weren't just tricks or routines. He understood we were trying to save lives." Mai, who had been reviewing her footage, suddenly noticed something remarkable. "Look at this pattern," she said, showing her tablet to Dr. Patel. "Every time Mr. Mitchell mentions medical treatment or wounded soldiers, Kong's behavior shifts to protection mode. It's not random. There's a clear correlation between specific topics and his responses." Dr. Patel studied the footage with intense interest. This suggests an even deeper level of cognitive processing than we initially thought, she said. He's not just responding to physical cues or commands. He's demonstrating contextual understanding of complex situations and concepts. Thomas watched as Kong continued his protective vigil, remembering countless nights in the jungle when this same vigilant presence had meant the difference between life and death. "We never really understood how much they comprehended," he said, quietly. "Everyone treated the elephants like tools, like living trucks for moving supplies. But Kong, he understood what we were doing. He knew when someone was critically wounded, knew when we needed absolute silence for delicate procedures." The morning had stretched into early afternoon, but none of the observers felt any inclination to end this extraordinary reunion. Each moment seemed to reveal new insights into elephant cognition and the lasting impact of shared trauma and purpose. Kong remained attentive to every movement, every sound, his behavior a perfect blend of military training and genuine emotional connection. Thomas watched as Kong continued his protective vigil, remembering countless nights in the jungle when this same vigilant presence had meant the difference between life and death. "We never really understood how much they comprehended," he said quietly. "Everyone treated the elephants like tools, like living trucks for moving supplies. But Kong, he understood what we were doing. He knew when someone was critically wounded, knew when we needed absolute silence for delicate procedures." The morning had stretched into early afternoon, but none of the observers felt any inclination to end this extraordinary reunion. Each moment seemed to reveal new insights into elephant cognition and the lasting impact of shared trauma and purpose. Kong remained attentive to every movement, every sound, his behavior a perfect blend of military training and genuine emotional connection. Dr. Patel began documenting specific patterns in Kong's protective behaviors, noting how they corresponded with different environmental triggers. "It's remarkable how he's maintained not just the physical movements, but the situational awareness," she observed. "Each response is perfectly calibrated to the perceived level of threat or need." "We had a system," Thomas explained, watching as Kong demonstrated another remembered protocol. "Different positions for different situations, one for general patrol, another for medical evacuations, a third for when we were treating critical cases." His voice grew softer as he recalled the circumstances that had necessitated such precise training. "The position he's in now. This was our formation for the most dangerous situations, when we had to protect wounded men during active combat." Mai, still recording every moment, noticed something in Kong's eye movement patterns. "He's maintaining the same scanning rhythm you described in your journal," she said, showing Thomas the footage. 3 seconds on each sector, just like you wrote about. Even the order of the scan is identical. High ground, approach routes, retreat paths. That scanning pattern saved our lives more times than I can count," Thomas replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Kong could spot movement in the jungle that none of us could see. He'd alert us to potential threats long before they became immediate dangers." He paused, watching as Kong completed another perfect scan sequence. "But what amazes me most is how he knew which threats needed immediate response and which could be monitored from a distance. That wasn't something we could train. It was pure intelligence and intuition." Dr. Patel made another notation in her already extensive notes. "This adds another layer to our understanding of elephant cognitive capabilities," she said. "The retention of not just learned behaviors, but learned judgment, the ability to assess and categorize threats based on past experience. This is unprecedented in our research." The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, casting shifting patterns on Kong's weathered skin as he maintained his protective stance, a living bridge between past and present, between war and peace. between separation and reunion. His unwavering attention to his rediscovered friend spoke of a bond that had somehow survived nearly half a century of separation. As the afternoon progressed, other sanctuary staff members had quietly gathered at a respectful distance, drawn by reports of the extraordinary reunion taking place. Among them was Dr. Sarah Chen, the sanctuary's chief veterinarian, who watched the interaction with profound professional interest. She had treated Kong for minor ailments over the years and had always noted something different about his behavior compared to other elderly elephants. "Now it all makes sense," she said quietly to Dr. Patel. "His unusual reactions during medical treatments, the way he positions himself during examinations. He's been drawing on his wartime medical unit training this entire time." She shook her head in amazement. "We just never had the context to understand it." Thomas overheard their conversation and turned to them, his hands still maintaining gentle contact with Kong's trunk. "How do you mean?" he asked, his voice carrying both curiosity and concern for his old friend's well-being. Kong remained steadfast beside him, his massive presence both protective and comforting. Dr. Chen stepped forward carefully, respecting the space that Kong had established around Thomas. "Unlike our other elephants, Kong has always shown an unusual level of cooperation during medical procedures," she explained. "He not only remains calm, but often adjusts his position to provide better access to injured areas. Sometimes he even seems to be attempting to show us where he's experiencing discomfort." "That was part of our training," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "We taught the medical unit elephants to cooperate with treatment procedures. They needed to stay still during field surgeries, often under difficult conditions." He turned to Kong, who was watching the conversation with apparent interest. But Kong took it further than any of the others. He learned to recognize the signs of internal injuries, infections, even shock. Dr. Patel was rapidly documenting this new information. "This could revolutionize our approach to elephant medical care," she said. "The implications for training and treatment protocols are enormous." She paused, watching as Kong demonstrated his understanding by shifting into what was clearly a position designed to facilitate medical examination. Mai, who had been reviewing her footage, suddenly noticed something remarkable. "Look at this," she said, showing her tablet to the group. "Every time we discuss medical treatment, Kong's ear position changes in a specific way. It's like he's signaling his understanding of the context." Thomas nodded, recognition flooding his features. "We used that ear position as a confirmation signal during medical operations," he explained. "It meant he understood the situation was critical and silence was needed." His voice cracked slightly. "He used to maintain that exact position for hours during delicate procedures, especially when we were treating critical injuries." Dr. Chen watched in fascination as Kong continued to demonstrate his remembered medical protocols. "This explains so much about his behavior during his own treatments," she said. "Last year, when he had an infected foot, he actually presented the injured leg to us before we'd even begun our examination. We thought it was remarkable. But now, he's applying his training," Thomas finished for her, pride evident in his voice. "Even after all these years, he remembers the importance of early medical intervention." He turned to Kong, speaking in the mixed English and Vietnamese they had used during the war. "You never forgot any of it, did you, old friend?" Kong responded by gently touching Thomas's chest with his trunk, then extending it toward Dr. Chen in what appeared to be a gesture of introduction. The movement was so deliberate, so clearly purposeful, that it brought tears to several observers' eyes. He was literally introducing his old medical officer to his current one. "The cognitive sophistication required for this kind of behavior is extraordinary," Dr. Patel said, her voice hushed with amazement. "He's not just remembering his training, he's making complex connections between past and present medical care experiences. She made another note in her already full notebook. This could completely change our understanding of elephant intelligence and memory capabilities. Thomas watched as Kong continued to demonstrate his remembered medical protocols, each movement a testament to the deep bond they had forged in the crucible of war. The elephant's behavior was not just muscle memory or conditioned response. It showed understanding, adaptation, and an intelligence that had not dimmed with the passing decades. "You know," Thomas said softly, addressing both the elephant and the gathered observers, during the war, there were nights when Kong's medical instincts saved lives that even our trained medics couldn't save. He could sense things we couldn't, understand trauma responses we might miss. He paused, overwhelmed by the memories. And now, seeing him remember all of this, apply it in new contexts. It's like he never stopped being that dedicated medical unit elephant, even after all these years. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the sanctuary trees as this extraordinary reunion continued to unfold, revealing new layers of understanding about both elephant cognition and the enduring impact of shared purpose and trust. As the afternoon deepened, Thomas found himself sharing more detailed memories with the sanctuary staff, each one seeming to trigger new responses from Kong. The elephant remained attentive, his behavior shifting subtly with each story, as if the memories were coming alive for him as well. "There was this one night," Thomas began, his voice taking on a distant quality. "During the height of the monsoon season, we had 3 critically wounded soldiers, and our medical supplies were running dangerously low." He paused, noticing how Kong's posture changed at the mention of the monsoon, his trunk lifting slightly, as if testing the air for rain. The nearest medical station was 5 miles away through dense jungle, and the rain was making the trails nearly impassable. Dr. Patel noticed Kong's reaction to the story. "Look at how his body position has shifted," she whispered to Dr. Chen. "He's automatically moving into what would have been the optimal stance for navigating slippery terrain." The elephant's feet had indeed spread slightly, his weight distributed in a way that would have provided maximum stability on treacherous ground. "Kong was our only hope of getting those supplies," Thomas continued, reaching out to touch the elephant's trunk. Reassuringly, the roads were too muddy for vehicles, and the weather was too severe for helicopters. "We loaded him up with every empty container we had, and I led him out into the storm." His voice grew thick with emotion. He never hesitated, not even when the lightning was striking so close we could feel the electricity in the air. As if responding to the memory, Kong let out a low rumble, the same sound he used to make to comfort nervous soldiers during storms. The sound was so familiar that Thomas had to take a moment to compose himself before continuing. "The truly remarkable thing wasn't just that he made the journey," Thomas went on, "but how he adapted to the conditions. When one trail was washed out, he found another. When fallen trees blocked our path, he cleared them. He even used his trunk to test the depth of mud before stepping into it, making sure it was safe for both of us." Mai, who had been documenting everything, suddenly spoke up. "That matches perfectly with some unusual behavior we've observed during our rainy seasons," she said. "Kong often seems to lead other elephants to higher ground before storms, and we've seen him testing ground stability in flooded areas. He's been applying his old training to protect the sanctuary herd," Dr. Chen realized, making quick notes in her medical log. "All these behaviors we thought were just unusual quirks. They're actually survival skills he learned during the war." Thomas nodded, watching as Kong demonstrated his old technique for testing ground stability, his trunk moving in precise patterns across the earth. "We lost a lot of good men in those jungles," he said quietly, "but we would have lost many more without elephants like Kong. They weren't just transport animals, they were members of our medical team, as dedicated to saving lives as any human medic. Dr. Patel observed Kong's continued demonstrations with growing amazement. The precision of his remembered behaviors is unprecedented, she said. These aren't simple conditioned responses. They're complex problem-solving strategies that he's maintained and adapted over decades. As they watched, Kong began a series of movements that Thomas immediately recognized. The elephant was recreating their supply transportation protocol, showing how they used to secure critical medical materials during dangerous weather conditions. His trunk moved with surprising delicacy, mapping out the exact positions where different types of supplies would have been secured. "See how he's checking the balance points," Thomas explained, his voice filled with pride. "We had to distribute the weight perfectly, especially with liquid supplies like plasma and medication. Kong learned exactly how to adjust his gait to keep everything stable, even on the steepest trails." He paused, watching as Kong completed the demonstration. "But what amazes me most is how he understood the urgency of different situations. Somehow he knew when we were carrying supplies for critical cases, and he would push himself harder, move faster, take more risks." The sanctuary staff watched in fascination as Kong continued to demonstrate various techniques for navigating difficult terrain and protecting sensitive cargo. Each movement was precise, purposeful, a testament to both his intelligence and the thoroughness of his training. But more than that, his behavior showed an understanding of the vital importance of his role in saving lives. "You know," Dr. Chen said thoughtfully, "this explains something else we've observed. During medical procedures with other elephants, Kong often positions himself nearby, maintaining what we now realize is his old guard stance from your medical unit days. He's still acting as a protector during medical treatments, just as he did during the war." As the afternoon began to wane, Dr. Patel suggested they move to Kong's favorite resting area, a peaceful grove near a small stream that reminded Thomas of the places they used to stop for rest during their medical missions. Kong led the way with the same measured pace he had used during their transport operations, occasionally pausing to check their surroundings out of old habit. "There's something I've been wanting to ask," Thomas said as they walked, his hand resting lightly on Kong's trunk. "In all these years at the sanctuary, has he shown any signs of trauma? From the war, I mean." The question had been weighing on him, part of the guilt he'd carried for 45 years about leaving his friend behind. Dr. Chen and Dr. Patel exchanged glances before Dr. Chen answered carefully. "We've observed certain behaviors that make more sense now, knowing his history. He becomes agitated during thunderstorms, particularly when there's distant thunder that sounds like artillery fire. And he has a very strong reaction to any kind of explosive sound, fireworks from nearby villages, for instance. But," Dr. Patel added quickly, seeing the pain cross Thomas's face, "he's also demonstrated remarkable resilience. His protective instincts, especially toward injured elephants, suggest he's transformed those experiences into something positive. He's become something of a guardian figure in our herd." As if to demonstrate this point, Kong suddenly raised his trunk, alert to something the humans couldn't yet perceive. Moments later they heard the distress call of a young elephant from somewhere in the sanctuary. Kong's reaction was immediate but measured. He turned to Thomas first, touching him gently with his trunk as if asking permission to respond, just as he used to do when they heard calls for medical assistance during the war. "Go ahead, old friend," Thomas said softly, recognizing the gesture. "Some things never change, do they? You still can't ignore someone in distress." His voice was thick with emotion as he watched Kong move purposefully toward the sound, his stride shifting into what Thomas recognized as his response mode gait. "This is fascinating," Mai said, recording Kong's response. He's moving exactly like you described in your journal. Quick but careful, alert but not panicked. It's the same approach pattern you documented for medical response situations. The group followed at a distance as Kong made his way toward the distressed calls. They found a young elephant who had become entangled in some vines near the water's edge. What they witnessed next left even the experienced sanctuary staff in awe. Kong approached the younger elephant with what could only be described as professional calm. He positioned himself exactly as he would have during a medical emergency. In the war, creating a safe space around the distressed animal while using his trunk to carefully assess the situation. His movements were deliberate and reassuring, displaying the same gentle efficiency Thomas remembered from countless medical operations. "It's exactly the same technique we used for trapped soldiers," Thomas whispered, watching as Kong methodically helped free the young elephant. The approach, the calming touches, even the way he's standing to shield the younger elephant from open areas, it's all straight from our medical protocols. Dr. Patel was rapidly documenting every detail of the interaction. This is remarkable. He's not just remembering the procedures, he's adapting them for a completely different situation. The cognitive flexibility required for this kind of behavior modification is extraordinary. As they watched, Kong completed the rescue with practiced efficiency. Once the young elephant was free, he performed what Thomas immediately recognized as a post-incident check, the same routine they had used to ensure no injured soldiers were left behind after an operation. "Look how he's scanning the area in that systematic way," Dr. Chen observed. "It's the same pattern we've seen him use during herd movements, but we never understood its significance before. He's actually conducting a medical sweep of the territory." The young elephant, now calmed and free, stayed close to Kong as they made their way back to the main group. The older elephant's protective stance never wavered, his attention divided between his charge and his surroundings, in a perfect display of his military medical training. "You know what this means, don't you?" Thomas said, his voice quiet but intense. "All these years he hasn't just been remembering his training. He's been continuing his mission. Every rescue, every protective action, every time he's helped an injured elephant. He's been doing exactly what we trained him to do, saving lives and protecting the vulnerable." The revelation seemed to hang in the air as they watched Kong guide the young elephant back to safety. The setting sun cast long shadows through the trees, highlighting the magnificent figure of the old war elephant, still dedicated to his mission of protection and care after nearly half a century. As twilight began to settle over the sanctuary, Thomas knew his time with Kong was drawing to a close. The day had been filled with more emotion and memory than he could have ever expected, each moment revealing new depths to their rekindled bond. Kong seemed to sense the approaching farewell, staying especially close to Thomas as they made their way back to the main sanctuary area. "I don't know how to say goodbye again," Thomas admitted quietly to Dr. Patel, his hand resting on Kong's trunk. 45 years ago I didn't have a choice, but now—" His voice trailed off as Kong gently touched his chest, right above his heart, just as he had done on that long-ago day when they were separated. Dr. Patel exchanged glances with Dr. Chen before speaking. "Mr. Mitchell," she began carefully, "we've been discussing something during the day, watching your interaction with Kong. We'd like to propose an arrangement, if you're interested." She paused, noting how Kong's attention shifted to their conversation, his ears forward in that familiar listening pose. "What kind of arrangement?" Thomas asked, trying not to let hope creep into his voice too quickly. Kong's trunk remained pressed against his chest, the gentle pressure a reminder of their renewed connection. "We've never seen Kong so engaged, so purposeful," Dr. Chen explained. Your presence has not only confirmed our theories about his military background, but has given us incredible insights into his behaviors. We'd like to offer you a position as a special consultant to the sanctuary." Thomas felt his heart skip a beat as Dr. Patel continued. "You could work with us to develop new training protocols based on your experiences with Kong. Help us understand how to better care for elephants with similar backgrounds. And of course," she smiled warmly, "spend time with your old friend, Mai, who had been quietly documenting the day's events," added enthusiastically, "We could create an educational program around your experiences, help people understand the incredible bond between humans and elephants, and the lasting impact of shared trauma and purpose." Kong seemed to sense the shift in energy, his posture becoming more alert, more engaged. He performed one of his old acknowledgement signals, the same one he used to give when receiving new mission parameters. The gesture brought tears to Thomas's eyes. "He remembers everything," Thomas said softly, watching as Kong continued to demonstrate his old protocols. "Every signal, every procedure, every lesson we learned together. But more than that, he's been using that knowledge all these years to help others." He turned to face the sanctuary staff. "How could I say no to continuing that mission with him?" Dr. Chen smiled warmly. "We've already started documenting the unique behaviors you've helped us understand today. Kong's methods for handling injured elephants, his protective protocols, his medical assessment techniques. They could revolutionize how we care for trauma-affected elephants worldwide." As if understanding he was being discussed, Kong performed another of his medical unit demonstrations, showing the precise positioning they had used for treating wounded soldiers. The movement was as perfect as it had been 45 years ago, a testament to both his intelligence and the importance of his military medical service. "There's something else," Mai added, reviewing her day's footage. "Every time we discuss the future, Kong's behavior shifts to what you described as his training mode. It's as if he's ready to pass on his knowledge, to continue his mission in a new way." Thomas felt overwhelming emotion wash over him as he watched Kong, now actively demonstrating different medical transport positions to a small group of younger elephants that had gathered nearby. "He's already teaching," he whispered in amazement. "Look at how he's modifying the movements to make them clearer, simpler for the younger ones to understand." Dr. Patel nodded enthusiastically. "This is exactly why we need you both. Together, you could help us develop completely new approaches to elephant rehabilitation and care. Your shared experiences could benefit generations of elephants to come." As the last light of day filtered through the canopy, Thomas stood beside Kong, both of them watching the younger elephants attempt to mimic the old war elephant's gentle but precise movements. The scene felt like both an ending and a beginning, the close of their long separation and the start of a new chapter in their shared story. "What do you say, old friend?" Thomas asked softly, using their mixed language of English and Vietnamese. "Ready for one more mission together?" Kong's response was the same as it had been all those years ago, a gentle touch to Thomas's heart, followed by the perfect execution of an ready-to-serve stance that brought tears to everyone's eyes. In that moment, as darkness settled over the sanctuary, Thomas realized that their reunion wasn't just about healing old wounds or bridging the gap of 45 years. It was about continuing the mission they had started together in the jungles of Vietnam, saving lives, protecting the vulnerable, and passing on the lessons they had learned through years of service and sacrifice. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.